Hello everybody, welcome to the final video on how to style a modern website. In this video, we're going to be taking the store page that we've designed earlier with HTML and style it to look exactly like this image on the right here. Before we get started, I want to say if you have been enjoying this series, let me know down in the comments which one of the CSS properties that we've used that you'd like me to cover more in depth in a future video. I'll make sure to read through those, find the best and most popular ones, and cover those in later videos to go more in depth so you guys have a better understanding of the CSS properties that we're using to style these banned web pages. Now let's get started here by opening up our store HTML page using live server to see what we have to get started with. Here we go. And the first thing that we need to do is copy over the style sheet that we've already created and link it. So we'll just copy this link here from the index page, paste it into our store page. So we now have access to all the styles that we've already written, and as you can see, it's already taken effect. The next thing that we need to do is go into our header here, and we need to style our header to be exactly like our home page and our about page, as you can see here. So to do that, let's just add the classes that we've already created of main header. In our nav, we're going to add the class of main nav, and then nav, and there we go. That looks good. Let's remove this HR, and then finally style our band name here with band name and band name large. We save that, and there we go. We have the same header that we have on all of our other pages. And luckily for us, this is the only thing we need to do in our header here. The next thing we can do is move on to this section and work on this music cart section right here. We can get started here by styling our section with the classes that we already have, such as container and content section. If we save that, you'll see we get a little bit of padding from doing that. And then we can also title our header here by using the class of section header, which we've already created. If we save that, we now see that our header for our section is properly styled. And now we can move on to styling the actual items that are going to be going into our cart. Let's first look at what we actually want the style to look like over here in our image. And we can see that we have the title of the item at the very top centered. We have the image here, and then we have the price and the button to add it to the cart on the bottom that are slightly inset from the sides of the album image. So in order to do that, let's first add a class to this div that wraps all of this content here. And we're just going to call this shop item. And this is just going to represent a single item that we have for sale in our shop, and this will be usable in the music and the merch section. The next thing we can do is we can actually remove the divs that wrap this album, since we can use CSS in order to make album on its own line without having to use a div to do that. So let's remove these divs here. And then we can also change the strong tag to a span, since we know that we want this album one to be bolded, but we don't actually want to put emphasis on it that the strong tag does for things like screen readers. We just want to style that in CSS. So let's add a class to this here, and we're just going to call this shop item title, since this is going to be the title and the name of our shop item that we have here. Next, we have our image, which we are going to add a class to as well. We can just call this shop item image so that we can style our image to resize it as we need. And then lastly, we have this bottom div here, which are the details of our shop item. So we're just going to give this a class. We'll call it shop item details. And inside of that, we have the price of the shop item here. So we can give that the class of shop item price. And then we have our button here, which we already have two classes for, of button and button primary, since this will be the bluish colored primary button that we have. And then we'll add another class to it of shop item button, so we can style this button specifically for the shop item as needed. And if we save that, go back to here, you'll see that some of the things in our page have already changed. We got the blue button now, and now we can actually go into our styles.css and start styling these elements. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to give some margin around our shop items so that they don't run up right next to each other, as you can see that these two items are. So if we go in here, we select our shop item, we can just give it a margin on all sides of 30 pixels. And if we say that, you now see that we have spacing on the sides, bottom, top of these shop items so that they won't run right up against each other. The next thing we can do is style this shop item title right here. To do that, we'll just select the shop item title, and we'll get started styling it. The first thing we want to do is we want to make it so that it is display block, so that way it'll be on its own line as opposed to being in front of the image if the width of our browser is large enough. The next thing we want to do is we want to make this item 100% width so that it'll take up the entire width of the top of the image, and that way when we do text align center, the text will actually center itself above the image, just like that. The next thing we can do is change the actual size and color of the font. So if we go in here, we can make the font weight bold so it is a little bit larger. We can make the font size be 1.5 EM so it is also slightly bigger. And then lastly, add a color that is slightly darker than our current color here. If we save that, you see that we now have a great title, but it's really close to our image. So we'll just add a margin on the bottom here. And we'll make that about 15 pixels. And we save that, and now we see it spaced out above our image, which is perfect. This is exactly what we want for our title. The next thing that we should tackle is the actual image of our shop item. Right now this image is quite large and takes up almost the entire screen. So what we want to do is we just want to change that so that our shop item image is slightly smaller than it is right now. So we'll just give it a height of 250 pixels. If we save that, you'll see that our image shrinks down a little bit, and the width and the aspect ratio stays the same because by default, the width will be automatically as large as it needs to be for the image to be the same aspect ratio when the height is 250 pixels. This is because we didn't actually set a width, so it defaults to auto. Next, we want to work on this details row down here where we have the price and the button for adding it to our cart. So let's go into here and we'll do shop item details. To select the wrapper that goes around our details for our price and our button here, and we'll make this display flex. There we go. The reason we're using display flex is because we want to center these items vertically so that they are all within the same line. As you can see, this price is at the top of the line here, and we want it to line up with the text in our button. So to do that, we'll use align items center in order to centrally align all of the items inside of this container. And as you can see, this looks perfect over here. The last thing we want to do is add a little bit of padding of 5 pixels on the top, bottom, left, and right, so that way it's slightly inset from the image and doesn't quite touch the image on the top. Next, we can move on to styling the actual price of our shop item. So we'll do shop item price. And this doesn't take many styles. All we want to do is make it so that the button is shoved all the way to the right side of the screen. So we'll set flex grow to 1 so that our price will take up as much width as possible. And if we save that, you see that it pushes this add to cart button all the way to the end of our container right here. Next thing we want to do is change the color to make it slightly darker. And that's really all there is to styling the actual item of our shop. But what we want to do is we want to make it so that these shop items will all flow around each other. And as you can see, our shop item doesn't quite fit within the space of the image. It's taking up way too much of the width of the screen. In order to fix this, we can go back to our HTML here, and we can wrap all of these shop items inside of a div, and we'll just give it a class of shop items. So if we go up here, create a div, give it a class of shop items. There we go. We put the end of this div at the end of all of our shop items for the music section right here, and indent everything so that it looks nice. There we go. And now we can actually select that shop items div that we created, and we can give it a display of flex. And if we say that, you now see that everything's all on one line, and it goes all the way past the edge of our screen. We do not want that. We want these items to actually wrap, so we can use the property flex wrap in order to make these elements wrap, and we'll just set it to wrap so that if it goes past the edge of our screen, they'll wrap down, and as you can see, now they all fill up in one column instead of wrapping all the way to the end of the screen. You'll also see, by changing flex, our display to flex here for the shop items, our image is the total width of our item so that our add to cart button doesn't get put all the way to the end here, and our album 1 title is properly centered above the image. This is exactly what we want. The last thing we want to do is when our screen is larger, these items will be right next to each other like this. And we want to make sure that there's space between them in the middle, left, and right. So we'll use justify content space around, which will put an even amount of space on the left and right of every single element inside of our container. And if we save that, we now see we have spacing between these elements and on the left and right of them. That's exactly what we want for these shop items. Now all that's left to do is to create all of these different classes and add them to all the different shop items, which I'll do real quick here. And there we go. That's all the styles that we need for our shop item. So now, as you can see, as we scroll down, all of our buttons and prices are styled correctly, everything's lined up properly, and if we increase the size of our screen, you'll see that our items will line up next to each other, which means that our site is actually responsive to different screen sizes. This is because we use display flex with the wrap property, so that if it became too large for our screen, it would just wrap to the next line, and if our screen was large enough to allow multiple items, they would all stay on the same line. This is perfect for our situation, since we didn't want our albums to only take up one line, or be two on a line when our screen was very small. So now what we need to do is do the same thing to our merch section as we've done to this section here by wrapping our container in a shop items div and then adding all of these different classes down to these elements here. I'll do that real quick now. And there we go. I've added all the different styles to our merch section since it's pretty much exactly the same as this music section here. And as you can see, if we increase our screen size to be large enough, there we go. Our items will be side by side, and if the screen size is not large enough, they'll stack on top of each other just like this. And this is a perfect example of our Flexbox working, because as you can see, these are side by side, but these are not, because this coffee image is actually wider than these images up here, so it needs a wider screen size in order for them to stack side by side like this. Now the last thing that we have to tackle is the actual cart down here, which is going to be the most complex part of this page, so stick with me. The first thing we need to do is go back into our HTML and style the different HTML elements that we need with classes so that we can style it to look exactly like the cart down here. So first, let's take the classes that we know we already have for this section. We can do container, and we can do content section. There we go. We can also style this header here with section header. There we go. And now let's get into the actual rows and headers of our cart. Right here, we don't need these less than and greater than signs anymore, since we're going to be putting the spacing in using CSS. And same with these strong tags, we can replace these with spans. So let's do that real quick. There we go. And now let's start adding the actual classes that we need. The first thing that we want to do is style the wrapper that goes around each of our rows. And we're going to just give that a class of cart row. And then we want to do classes for our different items. So we have our item column, our price column, and our quantity column. Since we want all these to line up and be the same width, we'll give this a class, and then we're going to give that cart item, and we'll also give it a class of cart header, since this item is in the header of our cart. And then lastly, we'll use the cart column class, which we're going to give to all of our different columns of our cart section, so that way we can do consistent styling between all of our columns without having to copy and paste it other places. Let's do a similar thing for the price here. We're going to give it a class of cart price, class of cart header, and a class of cart column. And then lastly, same thing for quantity. Give it a class cart quantity, cart header, and cart column. And there we go. That's everything we need to do in order to style the header row of our cart. Let's start by styling that in our style sheet right now. The first thing we want to do is style the actual headers of our columns. So to do this, we can use the class cart header to select them, and then set a font weight of bold, since these are going to be bolded. We can set a font size to be slightly larger at 1.2 EM. And then lastly, we want to make the color darker, so we'll just use this color that's slightly darker. And then we can move on to styling the actual individual columns themselves. So let's use the selector cart column here and get started styling that. In here, we can use a border bottom. We'll just use 1 pixel solid black border in order to put a border on the bottom here. But we also need spacing between our elements, because if we go back here, you'll notice that our borders are all running right up against each other, and this image is even overlaying over the top of our borders. In order to get around this, we're going to use some margins around our elements here. First, let's use a margin on the right side in order to space our columns away from each other. And we're just going to use a margin of 1.5 EM here. If we save that, you'll see that now there's some spacing between our different columns. We're also going to put a padding on the bottom, so there's spacing between the column and the actual underline. So we'll use padding bottom here of 10 pixels. And then we'll also put a margin on the top of our columns in order to put a little bit of space between the top of our column and everything above it. So in this case, the actual border of the element for this column. So we'll use margin top 10 pixels here, and perfect. Now we need to actually add these classes to the rest of our items inside of our columns. To do this, let's go back to our store HTML and copy over all of these classes to these other different elements here. Let's do this for the first one. We'll copy over this class cart row, put it onto this div here. We also have the cart item, which is going to include both the image here and this t-shirt name. So we need to wrap this inside of a div with the class of cart item. So we say this is our item column, and then we'll also give it a cart column class, since it's going to be a column inside of our section here. Put the end of the div down at the bottom. And now if we save this, you already see that we started getting borders on the bottom, which is perfect. Next, we can move over this cart price to be inside of this span here, since this is the price for our item. So we'll give a class of cart price and another class of cart column. There we go. We can also remove these less than and greater than symbols here again, since they're just used for spacing. And then lastly, we have our cart quantity, which includes the input and button down here. So we can do a similar thing where we wrap them inside of a div. So if we paste this div here, instead of cart item, we want cart quantity. And then inside of that div, we just want the input and the button. And there we go. Now we have everything we need, but you'll see that they're spaced out so that they're all on their line of their own. In order to get around this, what we want to do is we want to use Flexbox again in order to align these items properly. So if we go back to our styles.css, let's style that cart row, and we use display flex in order to get all these items onto one line, just like that. That's perfect. We're now running into the problem though, where our columns are different widths. As you can see, this item column here is not wide enough to support all the stuff in it. The price column doesn't line up with the actual price here, and the quantity is way off. In order to fix this, we'll use these cart item class, the cart price class, and the cart quantity class that we applied to our different columns in order to style the widths of these columns so they're all exactly the same. For our item, let's use a width of 45%. There we go. For the price, we're going to use a width of 20%. And lastly, for the quantity, we'll use a width of 35%. If you save that, you'll see that now everything lines up inside of the columns that they should be inside of. You'll also notice that if you add these numbers up, they equal 100%. But if you remember from our first video, when we were styling, or actually our second video, when we were styling the home page, you'll notice that we had to not quite equal 100% when we were creating our widths. This is because we are using inline block elements to style those, and inline block elements have spacing around them. Here we're using Flexbox to align our items, so we can actually use widths that add up to exactly 100%, because Flexbox does not add any spaces in between the items inside of its container. This is why I almost always use Flexbox when laying out elements, as opposed to inline block. Flexbox is also great at aligning content inside of its box to be centered horizontally or vertically, which is a problem you'll notice on the right here, where our content should be centered horizontally, or vertically, in order to look like this, so that all of our text is right in the center here. But over here, our text is either at the bottom over here or the top over here. So to fix that, we'll go back to our cart column here, since if you remember, all of our content for each of these columns has this cart column class around it. And we'll make this display of flex And then we'll use align items center in order to center our items along the vertical right here. If we save that, you'll see that now all of our items are vertically aligned exactly as they should be. And this is looking really close to what we have over here, minus all of the coloring that we need to do for our different elements. In order to specifically select the different elements we want to style, let's go back into our HTML here and add some classes to our different elements. The first element that we'll want to style here is the span tag with the title of the element. So what we'll do here is we'll add a class, we'll give it the title or the name of cart item title to specify this is the title of our cart item. We also want to add a class here to our image, so we'll just use cart item image to specify this is the image of our cart item. Our cart price is already styled, which is perfect. And then we just need to add styles to our input and our button here. So let's do class here. We'll just give it cart quantity input in order to specify this is the input for our cart quantity. And then our button will have the class of button, which we've already defined, button danger, which will specify a red colored button, and then also cart quantity button in order to specify that this is the button for our cart quantity. If we save that, you'll notice nothing over here changes other than the button styles are applied to this button. So then we can go into our styles.css and actually start selecting and styling these elements. So let's go down here, and first let's style the actual title, the t-shirt title here, by using cart item title selector. And then inside of this title selector, we'll put the color to be a slightly darker color. We'll give it a little bit of margin on the left side so that it's not quite right up against our image here, as you see. So we'll just use 0.5 EM for this. And then lastly, we'll increase the font size slightly to 1.2 EM. If you save that, you'll now see that our image is slightly pushed away from our item name, which is exactly what we want. Next thing we can style is the actual image, since our image is a little bit too large right here. So we can go in here, cart item image. We'll change the width to be 75 pixels so that this image is smaller. If we save that, you see our image is now smaller, but the height is too tall. So we're going to give it a height of auto, so the height will automatically adjust to the width. And if we save that, it's now within perfect aspect ratio that it was before. And lastly, we'll just add a slight rounding of the corners here. So we're just going to use border radius. And we'll just say, for example, 10 pixels. If we save that, it now rounds the borders just a little bit, which adds a little bit of extra aesthetic to the image, I think. The next thing we want to target is this price over here. And we already have a cart price selector, so let's just do it inside of that. We'll increase the font size slightly to be 1.2 EM, and we'll make the color slightly darker. And if we save that, we'll see that the price now looks good, and we really don't have to do anything to that. The last two elements, though, our input and our button, are going to take a little bit more work. Let's go down here and we can select that button danger class that we added earlier to apply this reddish colored button, and we can start adding our classes to this. The first thing that we want to do is change the color of the text to be white, and we want to give it a background color here that is going to be a reddish color. Just paste that in here. That'll be a red color, and if we save that, we'll see that we now have this reddish button. We'll want to remove the border from the button, give it a slight border radius so that it has rounded corners, and then lastly, increase it so that it is a bold font here. And if we save that, we now have a good looking button, but we have no hover. That happens when we go over the button. So let's add our hover effect using the hover selector here, and we can just give it another background color that is going to be slightly darker here. And if we save that and we hover, we now get a slightly darker red color when we hover over the button, which is perfect. The next thing we can select is our cart quantity input, which is going to take quite a few styles applied to it in order to give it a bluish border and a smaller size. The first thing we want to do for this is to make it the same height as our button over here. So to do that, we'll use a height of 34 pixels, save that, and we'll see that our input is now the same height as our button. We also want to change the width of this input to be quite a bit smaller, so we'll use a width of 50 pixels, which should be enough space in order to put our text and have these buttons for incrementing and decrementing the number inside of here. The The next thing we want to do is we want to give it a border radius so it has slightly rounded corners. We'll give it a border radius of 5 pixels. We'll give it also a border that's going to be 1 pixel. It's going to be solid colored, and we want it to be the same exact color as our buttons up here. So we'll just copy that background color from our button, and we'll paste that in here. Now when we save that, you'll see that we now have the border around our element, which is great. We need to give it a slightly darker colored background, which is just slightly darker than white. And if we say that, you can see that. We want to change our text color to be slightly darker. And then we want to make sure we have no padding around this element at all. And if we save that, our input element is starting to come up together. We just want to move our text to the center and make it slightly bigger here. So we'll do text align center. In order to center align our text, we use a font size here of 1.2 EM to make our font slightly larger. And then lastly, let's use some margin on the right here, 25 pixels, in order to separate our input from our button. And if you save that, you see that now this looks a lot like our mockup over here for our button and input. And that's pretty much all we need to do in order to style our row properly. Now I'm going to copy these styles from this row onto the second row and see what we have from there. And there we go. That's all the styles that I'm going to need in order to make this. We can also remove the HR down here at the bottom. And we can also remove this cart quantity button class, since we never actually ended up using that class. So let's remove that from both of our buttons here and save that, and you'll notice that everything still looks exactly the same. You will notice, however, though, that our underlined borders here don't quite look the same as over here. As you can see, we have a solid border on the bottom for our last row, and over here we have a separated border on the bottom. In order to do this, we can use the last child selector in our CSS in order to change the border for the last child. But the child element selector only works for the last child inside of a container. And right now, these cart rows are not the last child of the container that they're inside. As you can see, this div right here is the last child. So let's wrap the rows of our cart here inside of a container. And we'll just give this container here a class of cart items. Move this div down to the bottom here. Now we can indent all of this so it looks pretty. Save it, and you'll notice nothing over here actually changes, which is perfect. But now when we select the last child of the cart row, it'll be this cart row right here, since it's the last child of this cart items container. So now let's do that inside of our styles.css here. First thing that we're going to do is select the cart row, last child of it. And in here, we're going to use that border bottom property in order to set a 1 pixel solid black border that is going to go across the entire row here. If we save that, you'll see that we now have one solid border on the bottom, but we still have our individual borders that we want to remove. To do that, we'll again select the cart row last child, but we'll also select the cart columns that are children of that actual cart row, and we'll remove the border from them. And if we save that, you'll see that now we have removed these individual borders, and all we have is this solid lined border right here on the bottom, and that looks exactly the same as over here, which is perfect. Now all we need to do is style this total section and this purchase button, and we'll be done with this entire band website. Let's first start by going into our HTML and adding some classes that we can select these elements with. First, we'll use the class here of cart total that'll wrap our total and the price of the total. And then we'll also use class here of cart total title, since this is going to be the title of total. And then in here we have the class of cart total price, since this is the actual total price. And then inside of our styles.css, we can select those. So we have cart total, which is the row that wraps all of these. We'll give that a text align of end, so that our text will go to the end of the line here. just as it does over here. And then we can use the selector for our cart total title in order to change the actual text here of this. The first thing we want to do is make the font weight bold, since it is bolded in our design. So we'll change that to bold. We'll increase the font size to 1.5 EM, make the color black so it stands out, and we'll give it a little bit of margin on the right side. That way it'll be spaced away from our actual price, and we'll just say 20 pixels for that. And if we save that, that's starting to look a lot like over here, which is great. Last thing we need to do is just style the actual total price, so we can use cart total price to select that. We can give it a color that's slightly darker and a slightly larger font size, just so it sticks out a little bit more, of 1.1 EM. And if you save that, this now looks almost exactly the same as this, but you'll notice that our total is very scrunched up here against the bar, so we just want to add a little bit of margin. So we'll say margin on the top here from our cart total is going to be 10 pixels. And we'll also add a margin on the right of 10 pixels so that our total isn't squished right up against the edge of our screen, and instead it has a little bit of extra space. And that looks great right there. Our cart section is now exactly as over here. The only thing we have left to do is this purchase button, which will be fairly simple since most of the classes we have are already defined. Let's go back to our store.html here. We can remove this div that wraps this section since we don't actually need that. And inside of here, we can add some classes of button and button primary, since this has the primary colored button. And we'll also add a class of button purchase, since this is going to be a purchase button. And if we save that, you'll see that we already have styled here from the primary button class. And if we go into our styles.css, we can add some styles specifically for this purchase button here. The first thing we want to do, change the display to block here, so that way we can center this button by using auto margins. So we'll use a margin here. On the top, we want 40 pixels to space it away from our total section. On the left, we want auto margin. On the bottom, we want 80 pixels. And on the right, we want another auto margin. And if we save that, you'll see that our purchase button is now centered with padding, or margin on the top, and an even larger margin on the bottom to put it away from the footer. The last thing we want to do is increase the font size to 1.75 EM so that it is a much larger button. And there we go, that looks great. And that's a huge button for them to click when they want to purchase their items. Now all we need to do is style the footer down here, and this is going to be very easy. All we can do is go into our index page here. We can copy our footer since we know it's exactly the same, and we can just paste that into our store HTML. And if we save that, we now have the footer down here, and it looks amazing. This looks exactly as the page over here. And as we increase the size of our browser, our elements will flow naturally around each other. You'll see all of our columns stay lined up here. No matter how large or how small our browser is, everything looks great. And that's pretty much all there is to creating this store page for our band website. I really hope you guys were able to learn something from this video where we walked through the store page of this website, and I hope you also learned some things from the other videos where we discovered how to do the home page and the about page for this band website. The next thing that we're going to tackle for this band website is making this form down here interactive. So increasing the quantity here, for example, will increase the total down here. Removing will actually remove it from the cart, and clicking any of these add to cart buttons will actually add elements to the cart down here. This is going to be done through JavaScript, which is the third and final element that we need to learn in order to understand everything we need to know about front-end web development. So thank you guys very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. And if you guys want to know anything more about those CSS properties, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, please leave a comment down below letting me know which properties you want me to delve more in depth into, and I'd love to do that in future videos. Thank you guys very much.